Hello, and welcome to this series of interviews done by Musubi to trade industry experts. Musubi is an online platform that allows access to services that seek to facilitate and simplify the process of foreign trade.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro, and I am Musubi's marketing coordinator. And I wanted to welcome you to this interview we are having with Anthony Swain. Mr. Swain went to Michigan State University, where he studied Comparative Cultures and Politics, and then went on to study a master's degree in public administration in SDA Bocconi. And now he works in Italy as a sustainability consultant. Mr. Swain, thank you so much for accepting this interview. We are glad to have you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So yes, I'm glad that you asked. One of the things that I think it's really important to talk about when we're talking about sustainability is the fact that it's a term that not only refers to, let's say, the way that a company addresses environmental issues, but it's really a topic, or it's really something that is more, that encompasses more topics. So it also has to do with the way that you interact with the society that exists around your company, the way that you meet compliance needs, the way that you're treating your employees, the way that you're interacting with your supply chain and managing your supply chain. And I think a lot of times it gets thrown around as a topic or as a term that's used to refer to, a marketing ploy or tool for marketing. And I think that it's really important to highlight the fact that it's not just something that companies do because it's good marketing. And it's true that it is good marketing because a lot of times consumers are becoming increasingly conscientious towards the topic of sustainability in general. But in reality, it's also it's a management device. So it's a way of guaranteeing business continuity for your company. And managing and mitigating potential risks that your company might be exposed to, coming from these social governance and environmental areas that you may or may not even be aware of. And in fact, there's also been several studies that show that companies that incorporate sustainable practices into their management oftentimes outperform the competitors in the market that fail to do so, and even earn greater percentages of the market. So really, it's not just something that companies are doing in order to promote themselves as green or whatever, but because it makes good business sense. So again, I think that it really depends on the kind of company that you are. For example, the kinds of sustainability challenges and obstacles that you're going to have to overcome as a company will vary if you're, an agricultural producer or you make car parts or whatever. The kinds of topics, the kinds of issues that you're going to have to address, and the kinds of issues that you're going to have to work on really depend on that. So I don't think that there is, let's say, an overarching guideline that any company can use and implement, and it's like a way of achieving sustainability, because that's not really the case. However, I would say that in 2015, the United Nations has published 17 sustainable development goals that all organizations should really work to contribute to. So whether they be public organizations like governments or whatever, and even private companies as well. And the thing that for each of these 17 goals, which reference 17, let's say, macro areas when it comes to sustainability, each of them are divided into 169 targets and indicators that are specific for each individual sustainability area. So with reference to, let's say, environmental issues, I think for a company that's just starting out when it comes to sustainability, the most important thing to do would be to kind of get a sense of what the topics are, what the issues are in the industry. So if I'm an agricultural producer, the way that I use water, the way that I manage my land, etc., might be issues that are very frequently addressed in the sector. And so once you kind of have an understanding of what the issues are that your business is affected by, or that contributes to the issue, the next step would be then to develop, let's say, a set of parameters in which you can measure the way that you're contributing to the problem or detracting from the problem, etc., and coming up with a strategy and goals for reducing your environmental impact. And with that in mind, I think the Global Reporting Initiative is actually a good place to start looking, because it's an international organization that has actually published a series of sustainability reporting guidelines that companies can use to kind of help them to understand and report on what their impacts actually are, whether it's social, environmental, or etc. So with reference to, let's say, like an actual set of guidelines, I think that would be the best place for a company to start looking. So when it comes to climate change, obviously, as I said before, every industry has their own specific set of challenges that they need to overcome. I think a major issue when it comes to, let's say, the movement of goods, from one place to another, is our use of energy and the production of emissions, which is obviously the greatest contributor to climate change. So I think an important issue that we address right now is the way that we're consuming energy, especially when it comes to electrical energy that we use to, let's say, power our facilities, or the fuel that we consume in order to power our ships or our planes or our trains, etc. Because whether or not you're aware of it, all of these things generate CO2 emissions, right? Even the electrical energy that we consume to power our plants, or even the electricity that we're using to host this interview, for example, it generates CO2 emissions. And which I think is something that a lot of people are not really aware of, because the way that actually electricity is generated is through, in let's say 80% of the cases, it's through the combustion of fossil fuels. So when it comes to what we can improve, I would say these are the biggest two areas to work on. And what we can do specifically would be to, as a transportation company, what I might do is opt for more sustainable means of travel. So that could be, let's say, moving from aviation to seaborne transportation or rail transportation, for example. Or when it comes to powering my plant, what I might opt for is, if I have the potential to select my energy provider, would be to opt for an energy provider that would provide me with certified green energy, so energy that's produced through through renewable resources. And then the final thing, which I think is really the most important thing to keep in mind, is that we really ought to be making sure that we make our energy consumption as efficient as possible. So let's say that I'm in a scenario in which I'm not really able to do any of the things that I indicated before. So let's say choosing a new energy provider, etc. Something that I should try to do is, let's say, make the production cycle within my own company as energy efficient as possible, so that not only do I reduce my energy costs, but I also reduce the amount of CO2 that my production cycle emits. And for those emissions that are unavoidable, what a lot of companies actually seek to do, it's actually very common practice in the transportation industry, is to do what we call compensate for the emissions that are produced by funding initiatives or investing in technologies, whatever, that actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So those are just a few things that I think a lot of companies might be interested or would be able to do. Is not actually as hard as it seems. I think that not only can there be a connection between the two, but there absolutely needs to be a connection between the two. So actually, as I have been researching, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, transportation, whether it's of freight or of people, is actually responsible for around 23% of global emissions, which is quite a lot. So, with that in mind, and the thing is that also, they're responsible for 23% of global emissions, and the reality is, given the current trajectory of our economy, the kinds of services and goods that are entailed in transportation and that industry are really only set to increase actually over time, is what the IPCC has found. And this is actually potentially dangerous because currently the mitigation measures that we have in place to actively detract the CO2 emissions that we have in the environment from the atmosphere have the potential to be, let's say, outweighed by the potential CO2 emissions that might be generated through this additional transportation. So, with that said, I think from not only from a purely environmentalist point of view, but also from a business point of view, I think consumers are going to be, especially as we're moving towards the future, consumers are going to be increasingly conscientious of this topic, especially as the climate crisis intensifies, which is all the more reason for importers and exporters to be aware and active when it comes to sustainability and ecological sustainability, and not only from the part of the consumer, but also I think from the part of the market regulator. We're going to see a lot more attention to sustainability already in a European market context. We're seeing that certain companies are actually legally obliged to report on their sustainability practices. And actually starting from next year, the use of certain kinds of single-use plastic is actually going to be banned across Europe. So these are, like I said before, these are trends that are really only set to continue, looking at the current trajectory, of the way things are going presently. So I think that's one thing that importers and exporters really have to keep in mind as we move on to the next phases of, as we move out of this COVID-19 madness. That's a good question. So as I had mentioned before, the IPCC has actually done an extensive, so they're the international organization that publishes a lot of the research when it comes to climate change. And in a lot of the research that they do, what we've seen is that they actually do what's an industry-based research. So for each, let's say, segment of the economy, they do an in-depth research on how and in what ways it contributes to the climate crisis. And what they found actually is that when it comes to transportation, obviously the more heavy emitters in the industry is aviation. It's not always something that we can avoid, obviously. It's something that, given the trends that we're seeing in the markets right now, so let's say consumers want to order something and they want it now, it's something that, for certain items, for certain things, for certain businesses, it's a non-negotiable, something that needs to be done. But unfortunately, it's one of the most heavily emitting forms of transportation in the industry right now. What the IPCC is actually suggesting is that transportation be that companies actually opt for more seaborne travel or for more rail transportation, so like trains and ships and stuff. And the reason why is because these in general tend to be less heavily emitting when it comes to CO2 pollution. And the reason for that is because there has been a lot of push due to other, let's say, mega trends that have shaped the global economy, such as like urbanization, which are pushing for restructuring of urban infrastructure and redesign of urban infrastructure. This sort of megatrend is actually pushing for innovations in these sort of sectors. So like the innovation of ports, the innovation of rail transportation, even between cities and in between countries. And something that's very interesting, actually, that IPCC found is that due to these sorts of innovations, so let's say, like for example, high-speed rail is actually set to detract some of the demand for aviation travel, especially with regards to short and medium distance transportation, just because it's more, not only more cost efficient, but also better for the environment. So that's those are, I would say, are the, generally speaking, are the segments of transportation that tend to be more sustainable when it comes to an environmental point of view. So I think, I mean, of course, there's not going to be a set date in which, that I can tell you, starting from March of 2020, where all companies are going to have to do X, Y, and Z. That's just not the case. However, I do think that as I said before, as the climate crisis intensifies and as things become a little bit more complicated, the global scenario becomes more complicated, we're going to see an increase in market regulations. We're going to see an increase in consumer preferences and expectations on the part of importers and exporters. So for sure, I would think in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see major shifts with that regard. But even already, I think within the European context, with a lot of the companies that I personally have worked with, it is common practice for them to not engage in trade with other companies that do not exhibit the same respect for sustainability standards that they do. So let's say, for example, if I'm, if I'm a company that produces paper and I don't manage the wood, the forest where I get my wood in a sustainable way, maybe I might lose potential customers because I don't possess let's say, the adequate certifications that would allow me to access those business opportunities. Okay, this is something that it has become fairly common practice among European major, let's say, a lot of the larger European companies. I think, again, it really just depends on what you do as a business. So, for example, as I said before, what the starting point really ought to be for a lot, even for the small to medium enterprises, is really to kind of get a grasp, get a hold, really, for what the issues are that affect your specific industry. So, what you specifically produce. Come up with the set of indicators, come up with a strategy, come up with goals, and even a timeline in which you want to achieve these goals in a general sense. I think to improve your sustainability, speaking very much on a general level, those are some of the things that I would start with. But with specific reference to environmental issues, again, even these really vary depending on the industry, but I think 3 areas that companies really ought to be paying attention to in these days are energy consumption and emissions, which is something that I touched on before, use of materials and production of waste, and the use of water and production of wastewater. These are 3 areas that I think really all companies in some way can work on to improve their performance. And with regards to specific initiatives that they could put into place in order to really improve their performance in these areas, I would say just, generally speaking, with reference to energy consumption and emissions, the things that I mentioned before, so moving to an energy provider that is certified, provides you certified green energy, let's say opting for more sustainable means of transportation. So rather than selecting aviation, opting for, let's say, seaborne transportation, for the objects that you're able to do so for, and those sorts of things. And for the emissions that maybe you can't really take out of the atmosphere, or that you can't really help but to emit, to invest in those kinds of projects that I mentioned before, that detract the CO2 from the atmosphere. And then with regards to the use of materials, obviously, try to limit your use of plastic as much as possible, just because that's going to be the tendency in the market in the coming years. Opt for recycled and recyclable packaging, and even make sure that your product, whatever you're making, is make sure that to be as close to 100% recyclable as you possibly can, which is also a trend that we're seeing in the European markets these days, movement towards more let's say almost a 100% recyclable product once the consumer has finished with its useful life. And then making sure that you're managing and reducing waste as well as you can, and optimizing your use of materials so that you produce as little waste as possible, and really maximize the amount of value that you create in your business cycle. And as for water, kind of the same thing, just making sure that you're minimizing as much as possible your use of it, and promoting, let's say, sustainable water use practices even amongst your employees, and making sure that whatever water waste you produce through in your production cycle, that you're treating the water according to legal standards, so that you're able to then drain it into the sewer system. I would say that these are the largest three areas when it comes to environmental sustainability that companies really ought to be giving attention to. Well, I think that in general, in the future, what we're going to be seeing is the mega trends that we've seen that have been shaping the economy, thus far, as we've seen over recent years, have actually led to increases in sustainability regulation and markets. And this has been something that's kind of been pushed by, let's say, markets being more conscientious and aware of what's happening, what the impact that they have is, and is also in part driven, I think, by, and it will continue to be driven even in the future, by consumers' expectations and the standards that they themselves have when it comes to sustainability, especially when it comes to environmental sustainability. It's a topic that right now is getting a lot of attention among consumers. So that's for sure going to be, within the coming years, something that becomes increasingly important for companies to address. I think when it comes to climate change and circular economy, which are two things that I think for a lot of companies, a lot of people, is right now more of a hypothetical than anything else. As they move from being hypothetical to reality, we're going to see a lot more, as I said before, a lot more regulation, a lot more push from consumers to do something, to be active when it comes to mitigating adverse environmental impacts. And I think that all companies, every single one, is going to be called to really re-examine their operating structure, the way that they produce and consume and conduct business, so that they really meet the expectations that their stakeholders have of them. I guess I know that it can seem really, especially for small and medium enterprises, that a lot of the things that that I'm talking about today can seem really daunting, really intimidating when it comes to, like, let's say the amount of investment and of time and resources that it really takes to become a sustainable company. To which I would say, as intimidating as it may seem now, keep in mind that the trends that I'm talking about are only set to really increase over time. So in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be even more intimidating. So it's really, it makes the most sense for you to invest now, because it's not just a marketing ploy. It's really something that you do to make sure that your company is really able to function in 5 years. That's, at the end of the day, that's what it really is. So I think the sooner you start, the better that it is. I think this is actually a question that's on a lot of people's minds, especially in my industry. And it's something that obviously we're looking into, because at this point it's really quite difficult to tell what the impacts are going to be in the long term. For sure, what we're seeing is a lot of companies kind of moving to make sure that they're taking care of their employees in the adequate way. Not only because the law requires it, as is the case, for example, here in Italy, but also because it just makes good business sense. It's what we would, it's what a sustainable company does. But with regards to the environment, with regards to climate change, for sure. For example, I'm giving you this, where I'm speaking to you from Milan, which for Italy is one of the most polluting cities when it comes to CO2 emissions and air pollution. And actually, what we've seen since the onset of the CO2, the COVID-19 pandemic, has actually been a reduction in the mass CO2 production, specifically in Milan, which is honestly, for me, is something very cool to see.
Yeah.
However, the overall impact, what the impact of this will be on the long run is really, it's too soon for us to tell. I would say within the next year or so, we'll have a better understanding of what the impacts really are of this pandemic, and hopefully we'll be out of it, and we'll have the distance to be able to tell what exactly has been the impact. Yeah, I think it will be very interesting to see the kinds of ways that companies adapt their operating model, not only to accommodate for sustainability risks and sustainability issues, so the amount of CO2 and their environmental performance, but also how they are adapting to this COVID-19 pandemic, because it's two things that in some cases work together, and in some cases don't necessarily go together. So it'll be very interesting, I think, to see the way that companies adapt to this.
Yeah, it will surely be something really interesting to see in the coming years. So, Mr. Swain, I would like to thank you very much for your time. It has been really insightful to hear your thoughts on identifying the key challenges to overcome in your industry, having really a clear set of parameters to measure, and also to seek maybe in the UN's goals and the global reporting initiative some basic things that you can start doing if you're an SME, or even if you're a large company, that you can take action now. So it's been really insightful. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you very much, Mr. Swain.
Thank you.
We hope you found this interview as interesting and insightful as we did. Thank you for listening. Everyone at Musubi wishes you to have a great day.